Before there were names for the stars, before the tides knew rhythm, before the word God even echoed across the mouths of mortals, there was chaos. And from chaos came Gaia and Uranus, and from them the Titans, and from the Titans the Olympians. But it wasn't until the gods themselves began to love, to rage, to grieve, that myths were born, and among those myths none shimmer quite like the story of the divine twins, Apollo and Artemis. They were not born in peace. Their arrival was a rebellion. Leto, their mother, was not a goddess of thunder or war. She was gentler, a daughter of Titans Coeus and Phoebe, radiant with quiet power and a beauty that made even the sun hesitate. Zeus, king of the gods, desired her, and as he so often did, he pursued her. But Hera, his wife, his queen, his storm of wrath, saw Leto not as victim or rival, but as a threat. Hera cursed Leto not with death, but with isolation. She forbade any land under the sun from sheltering her. No country, no city, no island was to give her rest. The earth itself under Hera's fury rejected her. Pregnant and pursued, Leto wandered across a world that refused her. Every stone turned its face. Every tree shook its leaves in refusal. The seas remained silent. The skies offered no answer. She was a mother with nowhere to give birth. But the world is vast. And in the quiet corners, where forgotten magic still sleeps beneath roots and rivers, a secret waited. An island not fixed to the earth, not bound by land, not claimed by any god. A floating place adrift in the sea, like a dream known as Delos. Delos welcomed her. The winds calmed. The sun paused. Even Hera's gaze for a moment was turned elsewhere. And in that sacred silence under a silver sky, Leto gave birth not to one child, but to two. First came Artemis, swift and silent her cries, like the rustling of leaves. Then came Apollo, golden and bright, the light of his laughter cutting through the morning mist. The island shook not with terror but joy. These were no ordinary children. Artemis opened her eyes and saw the horizon before she could crawl. She was the hunter, the moonlight made flesh. Born for wildness, for freedom, for the untamed paths of forest and mountain. She took to the world as though it had always waited for her feet. Her first breath smelled of pine. Her second tasted of blood. Apollo, her twin, burned with a different fire. He cried, and the clouds parted. He smiled, and the sea shimmered. Music bloomed from his fingers before he had words. Prophecy stirred behind his gaze before he had thought. He was light. He was law. He was the beginning of song and the end of silence. Together they were balance. Where she walked alone, he gathered followers. Where she hunted, he healed. Where she was dusk, he was dawn. But childhood, even for gods, does not last forever. The tales of their youth are scattered in fragments, half whispers from poets' visions dreamt by oracles. But what endures is the feeling they were close as breath and heartbeat. Twins, not just in birth, but in essence. Two sides of a divine coin tossed into the chaos of Olympus. And Olympus noticed. When they rose from Delos, no longer infants but divine forces, the gods themselves paused to watch. Even Hera, seething with ancient jealousy, could not deny their brilliance. Artemis, still so young, stood before her father Zeus and asked for her gifts, not jewels or thrones, but freedom. "Let me run wild," she said. "Let me never be bound to husband or hearth. Let me protect the beasts, walk the woods alone, and be feared by those who would harm the innocent." Zeus, proud and half afraid of the fire in her eyes, agreed. Apollo asked for a different path. He wanted music prophecy, the power to heal and to destroy. He wished for temples, for hymns in his name, for mortals to raise their voices in praise of light. Zeus, struck by the force of his son's ambition, granted it all, and so they stepped into their roles not as mere children of a persecuted goddess, but as deities in their own right. Artemis became the mistress of the hunt, the silver archer whose arrows never missed. She roamed forests with her band of maidens vowed to chastity, devoted to the wild. Wolves bowed to her. Rivers changed course when she wept. The moon grew brighter on nights when her feet touched the mountain tops. Apollo took Delphi. With bow in one hand and lyre in the other, he slew the python, the ancient serpent who had guarded the oracle's cave since the time before gods. Its blood painted the stones, and from that moment the site belonged to him. The oracle of Delphi spoke his visions. Prophets whispered his name in temples of white marble. He brought plagues and healed them. He destroyed armies with fire and sang lullabies that stilled the hearts of kings. They were young, they were beautiful, they were terrifying, but they were not without shadow, because power always casts one. For Artemis, her vow to remain untouched became both shield and cage. Mortal men, princes, hunters, even gods sought to win her favor. Some tried to trap her, others tried to tame her. All failed. And those who crossed her found only silence and death. Actaeon, who saw her bathe, was turned to a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. Orion, the great hunter, walked beside her for a time, but whether he betrayed her or whether Apollo's jealousy twisted fate, no one agrees. What's known is this: Orion fell, and Artemis placed him in the stars forever beyond reach. For Apollo, the cost of brilliance was arrogance. He loved too deeply, too recklessly. Daphne fled his pursuit, begging the gods to save her, and was turned into a laurel tree. Cassandra was gifted prophecy by him, but when she refused his desire, he cursed her. She would see the truth of the future, but no one would ever believe her. Hyacinthus, his beloved youth, died in his arms. Whether by accident or divine cruelty, none can say. Apollo wept, and from his tears sprang flowers. But grief could not wash away guilt. Still they endured, because even in loss the twins stood together. When one wept, the other carried the silence. When one burned, the other calmed the flame. They were not perfect. They were gods, but they were also family. And that bond forged in exile and suffering held strong through centuries of myth. Together they shaped the fate of heroes. They blessed those they favored and cursed those who dared defy them. When Troy burned, Apollo fought with Hector, and Artemis mourned the women who wept in its ashes. When Niobe boasted that her many children made her greater than Leto, the twins descended with arrows drawn. Apollo struck down the sons, Artemis the daughters, and Niobe, once proud and beautiful, was turned to stone, her tears feeding the rivers to this day. Merciless perhaps, but what is mercy to immortals whose lives stretch beyond comprehension? What is justice to twins born in the wake of wrath? They did not ask to be gods. They became them, and as centuries passed, the world began to blur their edges. Statues cracked, temples fell, new gods rose, but the sun still rises and the moon still watches. Apollo still sings in the strings of a harp, in the truth hidden in a dream. Artemis still runs in the wild places, in the hush before a storm, in the whisper of a wolf's breath on snow, because some myths do not die. They become the rhythm of the world itself. Gods do not age as mortals do, but their stories do. And as the world changed, villages turning to cities, kings rising and falling, empires blossoming like flowers before fading into dust, Apollo and Artemis remained their presence woven deep into the patterns of both heaven and earth. Yet no matter how high Olympus sat above the mortal plane, the gods could never keep their hands entirely clean of human fate. They watched from thrones of gold, yes, but the stories that reached them, those tales of love, ambition, betrayal, vengeance, echoed too closely their own divine dramas. And for the twins of Leto, those echoes were irresistible. Apollo, the god of light and reason, believed in harmony, in order, in truth. But he was not above pride. He adored civilization. He loved music halls, temples, festivals, and hymns sung in his name. He walked among philosophers and kings disguised as a mortal, his golden hair cloaked, his lyre tucked beneath his robes. He whispered inspiration to poets. He struck arrogant tyrants with madness. He demanded offerings not just of grain and wine, but of reverence. And in turn, he blessed cities with health crops foresight until they forgot to honor him. Then, the god of light became the god of plague. In Thebes, when the people turned from his altar, rats came in waves and fever scorched the breath from their lungs. When they begged forgiveness, Apollo stood above their priests and spoke through them in riddles. For he was not cruel, he was precise. To fail him was to fall into disorder, and to fall into disorder was to offend the very principles of the cosmos he embodied. To serve Apollo was to seek excellence in word, in art, in justice. And those who failed were not punished out of wrath, but necessity. Artemis, by contrast, cared little for cities. She roamed the borders, the wild places where gods seldom lingered. She was seen by shepherds only in glimpses, a flash of silver, a shadow in the trees, a sudden hush among the deer. She protected the sacred balance of nature. Hunters who killed for greed met her arrows in the dark. Travelers who defiled sacred groves disappeared into forests that never ended. But to those who respected the wild, to girls fleeing violent homes, to animals, caught in traps, to the wind that moved without name, she was sanctuary. And though she rejected marriage, Artemis became a patron of women, of childbirth, of the terrifying moment between life and death, when a child first screams and a mother's breath falters. Her hands guided both miracle and mercy. She heard the prayers of the frightened and the bleeding. She stood unseen beside midwives. She did not sing. She did not weep. She watched. And in her silence was something ancient and unshakable. Though their domains were different, Apollo and Artemis were rarely far from one another in fate. When one intervened in the affairs of mortals, the other was seldom absent from the ripple that followed. One such ripple began in a kingdom forgotten by time, where a boy named Iphigenies was born beneath a bleeding moon. His mother had begged Artemis for safe passage through childbirth. She promised offerings, temples, a festival in the goddess's honor. But years passed, and no shrine was built. The boy grew into a prince. He hunted deer in sacred woods. He laughed when the arrows of Artemis were spoken of in court. And the queen, his mother, never fulfilled her vow. So Artemis whispered to the wind, and one morning, as the sun rose over the kingdom's port, its ships would not move. The wind had vanished. The sea was still as glass. The king, desperate to launch his fleet for war, sent for priests. And the priests said the same name, Artemis. She had been angered. The wind would not return until a sacrifice was made, a life in exchange for the silence broken. And the life required was Iphigenies. The court reeled. The queen collapsed. The boy begged. But the king, cursed with ambition, chose war over son. And so the boy was led to the altar dressed in robes meant for triumph, his tears swallowed by ritual. Artemis watched. She saw the blade rise. She saw the fear in his eyes. And she stopped it. In the final breath, just before the steel met flesh, she swept the boy away in a gust of wind only she could summon. In his place, a deer appeared, bloodless, but dead. The priests fell to their knees. The fleet was freed. The war began. No one knew where the boy had gone, but in a forest far from men, a stag ran with a strange human brightness in its eyes. That was Artemis. Divine, yes, but never cruel without cause. Her brother, meanwhile, had his own story of judgment. In the land of Phrygia, a musician named Marsyas boasted that his flute was greater than Apollo's lyre. He challenged the god to a contest. The muses would judge. And at first, it seemed Marsyas might win. His notes were wild, full of the grief and joy of earth itself. But Apollo, golden, refined, brilliant, played not just music, but meaning, harmony, precision, truth that pierced the soul like starlight. He won. But instead of mercy, he chose justice. He had Marsyas bound and flayed his skin, stretched across trees, his screams echoing in canyons for centuries. Not because Apollo hated him, but because Marsyas had dared to challenge the divine and bring disorder to the world of sound. It was not enough to be talented. One had to know their place. But Apollo's wrath did not go unnoticed. Artemis scolded him not with words, but with distance. And that distance stung him more than any wound. For as twins, their bond was not just of blood, but of balance. She reminded him simply by vanishing that even light casts fire when uncontrolled. The gods learned too that the twins could not be divided. In the tale of Niobe, queen of Thebes, the lesson was cruel but clear. Niobe, proud and rich, had many children. She boasted that she was greater than Leto, who had only 2. Why honor Leto, she said, when I have given birth to nations? The air grew cold. The sky darkened. And Apollo and Artemis descended silent, swift, inevitable. With arrows that never missed, they struck down Niobe's sons and daughters, how many no one knows. Some say 6, others say 14. What matters is that grief came like thunder. Niobe fled to the mountains. There she turned to stone, a weeping pillar that still drips tears after thousands of years. It was not vengeance. It was remembrance, for the children of Leto were not to be mocked. And though they showed mercy in moments when dishonor reached their mother, they answered with fire. Yet there were rare times when love softened even the fiercest gods. In Delphi, a young man named Kyparissus tamed a sacred deer, a creature so gentle that even Artemis smiled upon it. He loved the animal more than life itself, but one day by mistake he killed it. In his grief, he wept endlessly, begging the gods to let him mourn forever. Apollo moved beyond words, turned him into the cypress tree, a symbol of mourning, yes, but also of endurance, of grief that shapes but does not destroy. To this day, the cypress marks graves, a reminder of love, of sorrow, of the divine touch in every parting. Because not all the twins gave was power or punishment. Sometimes they gave memory. They were not gods of chaos. They were not gods of comfort. They were gods of order, of purity, of duality, sun and moon, music and silence, hunt and healing. And the mortals who encountered them never remained the same, whether struck by arrow, or song by plague or prophecy. All who met Apollo and Artemis were marked, some by wounds, some by wonder. And the world, forever spinning beneath their gaze, continued its dance between day and night, between discipline and wildness, between gods who watched from afar and gods who walked beside the fire. As the years stretched long and the world reshaped itself, the divine twins did not remain as they were in youth. Even gods immune to time's decay are not immune to its weight. They watched civilizations rise and fall. They listened to prayers offered in whispers, songs sung in their name, and then silence as altars turned cold and new names took their place. Yet through it all, Apollo and Artemis remained not stagnant, but shifting, evolving with the world that once feared and worshipped them alike. They began as twins, yes, but not as mirrors. Over time they became something deeper, a balance, each the answer to the other's question. Apollo burning with the desire to be known, to shape the world through reason, through light, through prophecy. Artemis, who withdrew deeper into the wild places, guarding the sacred silence of things untouched by civilization. They were not opposites, they were twin arcs of the same eternal curve. Yet their paths began to diverge. Apollo sought legacy. He wanted to be remembered, not just worshipped in temples, but etched into the bones of culture. He trained oracles, composed music, argued with philosophers, healed cities, and doomed them when they forgot his name. His hands built things, poetry, law, truth. But as his name spread wider, his loneliness grew, because with each hymn written in his honor, he became more symbol than soul. Mortals feared him, adored him, but few ever truly saw him. He missed the purity of Delos, the simplicity of Artemis's laughter in the woods. The wild joy of discovery before prophecy turned every word he spoke into destiny. Artemis, on the other hand, grew quieter still. She no longer walked near villages, no longer offered soft mercy to those who cut down her forests and called it progress. She saw cities creeping further roads, slicing through groves, mortals praising their cleverness as they stripped the world bare. She did not rage, she vanished. They say she no longer appears to hunters, that her arrows have become dreams instead of death. That sometimes at the edge of sleep, a girl lost in the noise of the world hears a branch snap, a stag pass a hand on her shoulder that feels like wind and knows she is not alone. But Artemis did not retreat because she hated the world. She withdrew because it stopped listening. And Apollo, he tried to shout louder. There was a moment, a single story, when their divergence nearly became fracture. It began as many things do with love. Apollo loved many, but few stayed. His passion was intense, immediate, and tragic, and no love cut deeper than that for Coronis, a mortal woman of rare wisdom and radiant calm. She was not dazzled by his light. She challenged it, and he loved her for it. But mortals are frail, not just in body, but in trust. Coronis, fearing the god's devotion might become too heavy, turned to another man, a mortal suitor. hoping perhaps for a simpler love, one not woven with stars and omens. Apollo discovered the betrayal, not by his own sight, but through a crow he had once gifted the power of speech. The bird told him the truth, and in his fury Apollo did not weep. He struck her down. But as her body burned on the pyre, he saw the glint of life still within her. She was pregnant. With his son, too late Apollo wept. He reached into the flames, pulled the child from death, and named him Asclepius. The boy would grow to heal, to surpass even the gods in the art of restoration. But the wound in Apollo never closed. He had wanted love. He had found legacy, and he blamed the crow. The bird's feathers had once been white as clouds. He turned them black. A punishment, a grief, a reminder. Artemis heard of this and said nothing. But the next time they met on a high cliff beneath a sky full of stars, she looked at her brother and asked, "Is love worth so much pain?" Apollo replied, "If it leaves something behind, maybe." But Artemis shook her head. Or maybe love is meant to be given, not kept. He looked at her, his sister, his mirror, and realized they were further apart than they'd ever been. For Artemis' love was the wind through the trees, the ache of solitude that made one sharp, wise alive. For Apollo, love was a fire, burning, creating, consuming. They both bore scars. Still they never turned from each other. They argued, yes, fought even, in mythic ways that shook mountains, but they never forgot. And as the centuries turned, their influence remained. In every forest untouched by man, Artemis lingered. In every song that made a heart still, in every truth, whispered in the quiet of illness or ecstasy, Apollo waited. But it was when they were called to the deathbed of a boy named Hippolytus that their balance was tested once more. He was a devotee of Artemis, a pure soul who worshipped her and rejected Aphrodite, goddess of love. In revenge, Aphrodite sowed chaos in his family, leading to his death, crushed by his own chariot, cursed by misunderstanding and divine manipulation. Artemis, grief-stricken, carried his body to Asclepius, the healer son of Apollo. Asclepius, defying all divine order, brought Hippolytus back to life. And Zeus, fearing the destruction of balance between life and death, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. Apollo raged. He confronted Zeus, fought for his son. For the first time, his light turned inward, became a blade. He killed the Cyclopes who had forged Zeus's lightning. And as punishment, Zeus cast him out, made him serve as a mortal for 9 years. Artemis watched it all. She could have turned away, could have scorned his pride, his chaos, his grief. But she stood by him. When he returned, quiet, humbled, older in soul, if not in form, she was waiting. Because she had learned too, even immortals carry wounds that never heal. And it is not love or power that defines gods. It is how they carry their scars. Together the twins bore many, but in them they found clarity. Apollo no longer sought to be worshipped for glory alone, but for truth, for light in the darkness of human confusion. He spoke less, listened more. When he sang, it was not to be adored, but to remind the world of beauty. Artemis no longer struck down those who trespassed. She led them instead into dreams, showing them what they had forgotten, what they still could save. They became more than gods. They became guides, symbols, stories that echoed through time. And even when temples turned to ruin and prayers faded, their presence endured in the quiet spaces. In a girl who stands beneath the moon and feels brave. In a boy who holds a lyre and dares to speak his heart in music. In the balance between silence and song. Between the flame and the night that holds it. The gods do not die, not in the way mortals understand death. They fade. They dissolve into story, into silence, into symbols we carry without realizing. Apollo and Artemis, once worshipped in gold-lit temples, once praised in song, and sacrifice felt the shift long before their names left the tongues of priests. The world was changing. The old hymns grew quiet. The stars that once aligned with purpose now shimmered, without memory. Mortals built new gods, gods of progress, of glass and iron, of conquest, without rhythm or reverence. And yet, even as Olympus grew distant and the heavens changed their watch, the twin gods endured not in marble or thunder, but in places no altar could hold. They had lived for ages, guided kings, slain monsters, punished the arrogant, saved the lost. But now for the first time, they found themselves not called to war or to prophecy, but to stillness. It was not defeat, it was transformation. And in that quiet, the world asked a question it had never dared before: what becomes of gods when no one remembers them? Apollo, ever the flame, struggled first. His temples stood in ruin. Delphi, once his sacred seat, lay in broken stone, its oracle long gone silent. Yet he still saw his name whispered in corners of the world, in the curve of a violin, in the silence, before a doctor speaks the truth of a diagnosis, in the heartbeat of the poet who writes because he cannot survive without doing so. His power had shifted, no longer drawn from offerings, but from echoes of his essence. The healer, the singer, the seer. He walked among mortals unseen, in libraries and concert halls, in hospitals and theatres. He lingered in moments of revelation, in the soft light before dawn, in the breath held before a first kiss. He no longer demanded worship. He offered presence, and Artemis, wild and ancient, watched the cities spread like vines across her forests. She saw the groves where she once danced, paved over the animals she protected, hunted for sport or pushed from their homes. She did not rage, not in the way men feared. She mourned, deeply, silently. But Artemis was not built to be defeated. She withdrew, yes, but to re-emerge where she was needed most. In the steps of the girl who flees through the woods and finds her feet guided. In the stillness of the hiker who reaches a summit and feels a presence at their back. In the woman who births in silence and feels no fear. She remained in every untouched wild corner, in every moment where the world reminded us that it existed long before our names were carved into it. The moon still waxed. The deer still fled at the scent of danger. The wolves still howled. And she was still there. But the twins were not separate. Never truly. As the world changed, their bond held. They met at the turning of seasons on the cliffs, where ocean meets sky in caves, where time folds over itself in forests, where even the wind speaks in hushed tones. They spoke without words. He told her of the boy who composed music in the subway tunnels, fingers bleeding, but eyes alight with fire. She told him of the child who wandered into the woods, lost and afraid, and found a trail lit by starlight, though no stars were visible. They knew now that they were no longer gods in the old way. They were archetypes, essences. Apollo became inspiration. Truth in chaos. The flame in the cave. The voice behind the curtain. Artemis became protection, intuition, the shield of the vulnerable, the wilderness inside us that refuses to be tamed. And though fewer mortals called their names, those who did, truly did. Not out of fear, not even always out of belief, but out of need. A girl who ran from pain, who stood beneath the moon with tear-streaked cheeks, whispered Artemis without knowing why. A man dying in a hospital bed who had never prayed in his life, reached for something beyond the veil and saw a warmth, a light Apollo's touch in his final breath. They did not seek to return to Olympus. That throne had served its time. They lived now in liminal spaces, in dreams, in symbols, in the rhythm of things. When wolves howl beneath the moon, they remember Artemis. When music carries a soul through heartbreak, it hums with Apollo's voice. But the final gift of the twins is this: they do not demand devotion. They invite awareness. They remind us of balance, of duality, of the truth that we are both wild and civilized, both wounded and healing, both shadow and flame. And perhaps above all, they teach us this: that divinity is not power. It is presence. It is listening to the world even when the world is silent. It is watching the sunrise and feeling something ancient stir in your bones. It is standing at the edge of civilization and hearing a voice say, "You are not alone," because the gods we once feared, the gods we once worshipped, were never far away. They were inside us, in the instincts we trusted, in the truths we spoke, in the wildness we refused to kill, and in the light we refused to extinguish. Apollo and Artemis are not gone. They are in every breath that carries music, in every tree that still grows despite the concrete, in every choice we make to live with honesty or to love without permission. They are twins, eternal, unbroken, the song and the silence, the hunter and the flame, and in their story the world still turns.